One of the things that we had hoped to do for you today we will not be able to do, and that's show slides because it just doesn't quite darken enough to see detail in here. But the one point that I really wanted to make with those we can make without it, I'm sure, and there will be other times when we can do the slides. The thing I really want to concentrate most on probably is this idea of fall being a good time for planting. In addition to that, hopefully there will be time that you can ask, or opportunities for you to ask questions. The thing that has been so evident the last couple of weeks in the farmers market is the number of people who come by that because of the weather conditions this year have had problem after problem with their garden. So hopefully we can address some of those things. As far as the fall is for planting aspect of it, we have the sheet of notes that we passed out. I once knew a gentleman on Long Island who happened to be the president of the Long Island Nurserymen's Association. He grew up on an Ohio farm, went to Syracuse and studied forestry, and found himself at 40 a securities analyst on Wall Street, wondering why in the heck he was there, other than that, of course, he'd had a good bank account by that time. So he bought land out on the east end of Long Island and did what he had wanted to do all those years, which was basically start a nursery. With his good analytical mind, he started what probably was the best organized just the best system that almost anyone had ever seen for producing plants. It wasn't the sort of helter-skelter thing that, you know, a lot of nurserymen, traditionally at least, the old-time nurserymen, they grew a few plants in their backyard, got interested in it, and it finally expanded into a nursery, or eventually expanded to a nursery. This was all planned. And he began to produce some of the most unique things that were available. He searched them out, and he got them into the garden centers, etc. He was an extremely generous person with botanical gardens. If you had a need for plants, he would give them to you, whether it was for you to put in your collection or to sell, to raise money. Well, one day I got a call from him, asked if I would serve on a committee of the association, the Nurserymen's Association, that he was beginning to feel that people had grown so far from their rural heritage, their roots in agriculture, that they didn't realize that in many areas of the country, including Long Island, and actually this area here in particular, that fall is really the best time to plant most of these garden plants. Now, exceptions, of course, are annual, such as petunias and annual vegetables and so forth, which have to go in the spring because they don't overwinter. But the perennial things, in other words, there is no better time to plant these than in the fall. And that's basically then what we want to cover. The interesting thing was that that was a very successful campaign on Long Island for the Long Island nurserymen, so successful that the American Nurserymen's Association picked it up. For about 10 years, they put out banners and all this sort of thing promoting fall planting. It's sort of fallen by the wayside now. I think probably, however, that the same situation tends to exist in Fayetteville as did back in those days on Long Island, that a lot of people tend to just sort of overlook the fact that fall's a good time to do this planting. Some of it is the natural cycle of things. And I'm not just talking about the natural cycle of nature in itself. I'm talking about the natural cycle within us. Spring comes, what happens? You get enthusiastic, you want to go out and dig holes and stick things in them. Summer comes and the heat comes, and the Johnson grass begins to get tall, and you're lucky if you can find what you planted in the spring, etc. And fall comes, you're just glad to get rid of the whole concept of the thing. But the fact does remain that it's a good time to plant. And why? Well, we've given you a number of reasons why. When you begin to get cool nights, and we had one last night, our thermometer said 60 out in the wide open spaces, and that's a pretty darn comfortable evening. But when you begin to get cool nights and warm days yet, ideal conditions for the growth of many of these perennial plants that we're talking about, and the fall rains begin to come, You don't have to spend as much time on the hose taking care of them. In effect, this is the ideal situation in which to put those plants in the ground. One of the interesting things about it is that you get the plant in the ground, and as long as that soil stays, or down around the root, stays above 40 degrees, that root is still active. So that plant is becoming established even after it's been a killing frost on the top. Cornell University, along with this fall planting campaign, came to us at Old Westbury Gardens, and they wanted to do a demonstration on fall planting. So we had some nursery space available. We let them come in, and they selected a number of woody plants and a few perennials. And they started in August planting these things and ended in November. I don't remember what date exactly in the month. But in other words, they followed a succession of months with the same plants, putting them in the ground to see what would happen with them. I think one of the keys to what did happen was that they mulched it very well, which again, you see, kept that soil stable and above freezing. We had an old gentleman on the property who had been the estate superintendent when this was a private estate, and he ran errands for us and so forth, and he liked to keep busy. And we assigned him the job of monitoring the soil temperature. We had one of those Western thermometers with the stem on it that stuck down in the ground to where the roots were. He went one better. He recorded the air temperature day by day. The coldest temperature that year was sometime in early February as far as the air temperature was concerned. And you could just see, if you graphed it out, that temperature getting a little colder. But down here under the ground, the temperature was running along like this. Up above, you see. And it was actually about the second week in February before that temperature in that root zone dropped below 40 degrees. And by the time you got to the third week in February, you were beginning to build up heat again, and it came right back up. So in essence, those plants had all winter to become established. Okay, if you relate this to what happens here in Arkansas, you plant a plant in the spring, what comes right after spring? Summer, heat, drought. So basically, they only have a part of a season really to get ready before summer comes. And in most cases, summer is probably the hardest of all 4 seasons on these plants. Winter can be a little from freezing and thawing, but you can take care of that with a mulch. If you plant a plant in the fall, how many cool seasons do you have before summer comes? Fall, winter, and spring. 3 to get established. Okay, so let's get with it. Let's plant in the fall. There are other reasons for planting some things in the fall. We list here that spring flowering bulbs tend to only be available in the fall, so that you don't have a lot of choice there. Most other plants are available at this point in history almost continuously because they're available grown in containers, so you can buy perennials, you can buy shrubs, you can buy trees almost any time. And yes, they can be planted any time, as long as you take the proper precautions and water them and this sort of thing. But still, the point that we want to make is that fall is an excellent time. One of the other reasons tends to be that if you are going out to buy, or you're going out to someone who does professional landscaping, when are they going to be busiest? In the spring and early summer. When are they going to have more time to probably deal with you, to maybe even spend some time talking to you about what is the best thing, etc.? How about fall? So you're probably going to get more attention and be able to think things through better and get the things that you want doing it in the fall. Okay, all reasons for fall planting. Then we list a number of practices that are important in success with fall plantings. The first, and these apply really to any season you're going to plant, select plants that are suited to your site. In other words, don't plant shade-loving plants in full sun. Don't want plants or plant plants that like full sunlight in heavy shade. Now, I will have to modify that statement by saying that when you get this far south, I don't think there's half a dozen shade or sun plants that exist that don't like a little shade in the summer. So I think if you look at those books, most of those books over there, and they say this is a plant for sun, don't worry a bit if, particularly if it gets a little shade in the middle of the day, along, from about 11 o'clock to 3 o'clock, it probably just make it happy and it'll do a lot better. There's probably no better place to see this than the west side of the square. There are a lot of things that are planted in there that get pretty good shade up until 11 o'clock and even noon, that if you really look at the lists that are in books and so forth, are listed as sun-loving plants, and they're doing beautifully. So I think you have to temper that a little bit by realizing that when you begin to get to where you have hot summers, that many of the sun-loving plants will benefit from a little shade. And don't plant water lilies in a dry embankment, and don't plant junipers in the middle of a bog. So in other words, do a little work ahead of time, determine what the plants like, and give them that as far as the site is concerned. Particularly when you're dealing with perennials, plants that you're hoping they're going to be in that spot for some time. In some cases, it may be almost forever as far as you're concerned. In others, with some perennials, you may in 3 to 5 years need to come in and divide them, etc. But at least, in other words, you're not planting them every spring or every year. Used to, years ago, when I really had to make my living by selling plants, you'd get somebody that would come in, with a picture out of Better Homes and Gardens, and that's what they wanted, was what was there. And they wanted those perennials because it was so much less work. You didn't have to plant them every year. Actually, if you're looking for less work, plant annuals. You can clean the whole bed out once a year and bring a tiller in and take care of the thing. Perennials, this plant may need dividing this year. That plant may not need dividing. Something needs a little special cutting back, deadheading, so that it continues to bloom. And this one doesn't need it. If you're working mulch in, you have to work them in around these permanent plants, etc. So in other words, there's a lot of detail work in perennials. It isn't necessarily the easy way to go. Why plant them then? Well, they're just so darn much more interesting than most annuals. If I could have showed you the slides that I brought today, we would show you, however, that one approach to having perennials flowering throughout the season, or a border, let's say, flowering well throughout the season. At a time when, summer comes like it did this year, some of the perennials begin to sort of fade. Well, plugging annuals in here and there to supplement them, or in other words, using a mixed border, and even using shrubs with interesting foliage and so forth, can give you the continuity that sometimes you don't get with just herbaceous perennials by themselves. So anyway, perennials have a great deal of variety in form, in flowering season, in color, etc. And you sit down to work this out, it's a little bit like putting a jigsaw puzzle together. I used to teach a course at Adelphi University on Long Island that started with the plant cell and its function and worked up to the last day of class. They were supposed to have a landscape plan for their garden. It was a fun course. Most of the people taking it were adults. They were homeowners. They had a place that they really wanted to work on. And I taught them a simple procedure for someone who doesn't have T-squares and drawing boards, and that's to get a piece of graph paper or engineering paper. And if you get pretty good, you can step off your property within a few feet. Or you may even have a plot plan somewhere in a bank box that you can use as your base. And then you just take tracing paper and lay over the top, and you experiment with that. You draw in a patio, and I don't like the shape of that one. You throw that piece away, put another one there. You put a couple of shade trees on one of these things, and they ought to be moved here. So you just throw it away and get another piece of paper. And eventually you will end up with something then where all the pieces of the puzzle really tend to fit together. The first step I always told people is you make a want list. And are you going to be able to fit the swimming pool, the tennis court, the compost pile, the vegetable garden, and everything in the backyard? And they soon realize you can't. So it becomes, picking and choosing. One of the women who took that worked at the county museum, which was in an old house that had been part of an estate on Long Island. And she picked up on this concept, and in her final one, she did the main plan with a bold marker so that you could really see it through the layers she put over. And she did month by month with Mylar overlays, and then she colored in these groupings with the color that was going to be present in that month. And you had a complete season there. I gave her an A. And she went back and she did it at this museum building. She deserved that A. She was good. But in any case, you want to do your planning, your homework ahead of time, put the plants in the right place, prepare that soil ahead of time, because you don't want to be having to go in and move things out to prepare the soil. You want things to stay there as long as possible. This means that if you're particularly in this area, if you're planting acid-loving plants, you want to check and make sure that your pH is right. And you can do this through cooperative extension. They'll do soil tests for you. You want to work in plenty of organic matter. If anything is lacking in most of our soils here, it isn't rocks, it's organic matter. So you want to work your organic matter, get the stuff in that gives you an optimum environment for root growth before you get the plants in the ground. You'll save yourself an awful lot of effort, and the plants will do well. Select plants adapted to the region that fit the hardiness zone in which we reside, which is zone 6. It's interesting, Mark Cathy, who at one time headed USDA research at Beltsville, Maryland in ornamentals, and subsequently then went to the National Arboretum as their director, now retired, began to see that the hardiness map based on coldest temperatures was not really the full answer. You have to deal with summers as well. So he is putting in the process, and he has a book out, and he has a map out, but it isn't really worked out for all plants, how warm, basically, can these plants take it and survive. When that gets done, the combination of these two is going to really zero in on how to select plants that are going to do well in your garden. I think it's a good step. It's just that a lot of work needs to be done on the thing yet. One thing that you need to be aware of and to watch for is the idea of selecting based on price at the end of the season, and fall is the end of the season as far as particularly discount stores are concerned. And if you had something that's been sitting in there all summer long and is hardened off and tough and so forth, it's probably not going to do well for you. So you want to avoid those things. It always sort of surprised me that, and you find garden centers do this sometimes too, they've got a whole shelf of fertilizers and so forth there, but they never really ever think or get around to the plants that are sitting there for a while, beginning to realize that, hey, you know, if I fertilized them, you'd keep them going and it would really be nice whenever they bought them. So the things tend to deteriorate. And it's not a good deal to buy those unless you really know what you're doing, because you're going to lose a lot of those leftover plants. There are no bargains in the leftovers, basically what we're saying. Plant at the appropriate spacing. That's a little bit difficult. A lot of references really don't give that appropriate information. They'll give height, but they probably won't give spread. And you know, this, I suspect that there's nowhere that this was more evident than when they invented the picture window after World War II. And somebody put some little tiny plant out in front of it, and 10 years later woke up and found there was no picture to be seen out the window because the plant was taller than the house. So it's a little common sense, in other words. What you should do when you're planning, and there are professionals that are guilty of this as well, is that when you, if you actually put it on paper and you draw these little circles where these plants are going to go, You don't draw the circle for a 40-foot wide shade tree in at the size of the tree is when you plant it. When I moved to Long Island, the Levitt houses that they had built after World War II in the potato fields of Long Island that they sold for $5,600. Actually, when I left, they were selling them for $250,000. But of course, they'd added a garage and a couple of other things by that time. But those Levitt houses, Levitt had required 2 shade trees in the front yard and so many shrubs and so forth. They planted those things with marigolds and petunias and all these sun-loving things, salvia and geraniums as such. And I got there just at the time when these things wouldn't grow for them. They said, "What's the matter? I can't grow marigolds anymore." Suddenly, those 2 shade trees had gotten big, and they had a shady yard. And that was the time then they had to convert to rhododendrons, azaleas, and all those lovely shade-preferring plants. So you need to work those things out and have an understanding of what your situation is and put the right plants in the right place, etc. Appropriate spacing, as we say, is not an easy thing with some plants. You will find some references that will give it to you. It almost comes down to either talking to someone who has some concept of whether that plant is tall and narrow or tall and wide or short and wide, whatever it happens to be, so that you're sure, in other words, that you fill space, but they don't crowd each other to the point where the plants deteriorate. Some references will do that, as I say, but they don't really do it as well as they should. But don't overcrowd. One of the things that sometimes tends to happen with plants grown in containers is that the roots coil around inside the pot and they get very, very dense and root bound. That probably is not maybe the worst thing from the standpoint of perennials. The perennials, many of them grow new root systems every year, essentially, anyway, so that it isn't all that bad. But when it comes to particularly shade trees, this is when you have trouble. Why? Okay, you got a shade tree, it's in a pot like this, and you got a root circling it out here, about so far from the trunk. Okay, you plant that in your backyard. It seems to do well for a few years. And then eventually, the trunk gets as big as that circle. And that root that's going around it girdles the trunk and will eventually kill the tree. How can you tell whether this has happened sometimes in the tree that's in your backyard? A tree without girdling roots will have a tapered trunk at the base. A tree with girdle roots will have a straight trunk going into the ground. So if you've got a straight trunk going into the ground, you want to probably dig down carefully and see if there's a girdling root and take the hammer and chisel and cut it off before it actually does its dirty job, dirty work. So you want to be careful about that. And the best way to handle plants that have a root-bound condition, that ball of soil is just full of roots, is to do what some people call butterflying it. You take it out of the pot, lay that ball of soil on the ground, take a sharp spade or a sharp knife, and cut through that ball, let's say if it's in a gallon can, go down about 4 inches or about halfway, cut through that from the base, and then butterfly the 2 halves out. That disrupts this girdling root and gets those roots out to where they will begin to reach out in the soil. There's some controversy at this point about how good, we just talked about making that soil good. And for perennials and shrubs, I think that's the best approach. But there is some controversy at this point about whether you should make that soil too good for those trees that came in containers. Why? Well, if you've got a soil outside the hole that tends to be heavy, clay, rocky, etc., and you make a nice big hole and fill it with perfect soil, what happens when the roots finally get out and hit that hard soil? They turn around and follow around. In other words, they don't get out into the soil. So there's some argument, and I think there's some merit to it, that unless you're really going to change a lot of soil, for trees it may not always be the best thing to do. Okay, Once you get the plants in the ground, plant them so that in essence they are at the same depth as they would have been in the container, in the nursery, etc. There are exceptions when you're dealing with vegetable plants, such as tomatoes. You can bury those because they will grow roots, adventitious roots out of the stem, and it actually gives them a bigger root system. But most of the particularly woody plants and many of the perennials, in essence, if you bury them too deeply, you are asking for problems with crown rots, etc., because they just do not want that crown part where the top, in other words, emerges and the bottom, the roots come out of the bottom. They don't want that where it's buried, or you're liable to have problems with various rots, etc. Water in thoroughly. In most cases, people suggest not to fertilize when you plant. If I'm preparing a bed for perennials, I want to work fertilizer in with it, particularly superphosphate. Because why? Here's an agronomist. Why do you mix phosphate in the soil when you prepare the bed?
Well, phosphate doesn't move in the soil, and there's some other fertilizer nutrients do, so you kind of ought to get it there where all the roots will be at the.
You got it. In other words, you put it on top, and it tends not to move down through the soil the way other nutrients do. So you put it down there to begin with to build that supply of phosphate where the roots are. Okay. So you water in thoroughly. This idea, or this mentioning here an inch of water a week, by the way, is pretty good advice. That's about what it takes when you get a typical garden crop, whether it's a vegetable or a flower or whatever it happens to be. It takes about an inch of water a week during the growing season. Now, that has to be tempered, I think, with some concept of what your soil's like. If you have a very sandy soil, you're probably going to have to put twice as much water on. If you have a heavy clay soil, watch it. You don't want to overwater there because you can have problems. In general, what I have been taught is that if you have a heavy soil, an inch of water will penetrate somewhere in the neighborhood of 8 to 10 inches. If you have a sandy soil, it will go 12 inches or so. So you see the water is spread over a larger area in a sandy soil, which is why you have to water more frequently. And again, depending on the organic matter and how you prepared that soil, this will vary somewhat. But in essence, an inch of water a week for most plants, and if your soil is sandy, even more. I am not necessarily a fan of automatic sprinkling systems. You know, they can be wonderful. The first thing, if I put one in, I got to have a manual override switch. It used to get me when you would drive down the street on Long Island and you would see sprinkling systems on at a time when it was raining so hard you couldn't, windshield wiper didn't do you any good, and here were the sprinkling systems running. The other thing is that they tend to be set up automatically, and that automatic setting that it comes on so many hours every day or whatever it happens to be doesn't take into consideration that you may have had a rain that day. I had a neighbor in Westbury on Long Island who had an automatic sprinkling system right next to me, and one of his nozzles was kind of cattywampus, and it kept spraying over on my lawn. My lawn I watered with a hose and a sprinkler when it needed it, and I didn't water it very often. I didn't have to. Why? Because I tore the darn thing up when I moved in there and put a lot of organic matter in there, and with that organic matter in there, I didn't need to water a lot. If you looked at the typical sodding job on Long Island, it lasted about 3 years. And that's because they just stripped the sod off and put it right back on the same soil. And in 3 years, in other words, it had burned itself out, so to speak, because the roots couldn't penetrate that soil. And that's another story. We won't get into it, but it's called bulldozer hardpan after construction. But in his situation, he was watering the lawn every day. Where it came over on my lawn, I could walk out, take a hold of that grass, and lift it up. Watering frequently does not, that frequently, does not allow those roots to penetrate to give you good anchorage. You go away on vacation, the system burns out, and your plants are dead when you get home. In this particular case, you see, the roots actually weren't penetrating the soil where it was coming over on my lawn, and I'm sure it was the same on his. You could just take that grass and lift it up because those roots weren't holding anything down. So anyway, so much for that. And with the plants that we're talking about, particularly fall planting, a mulch to keep that soil that first winter especially sort of tempered so that you don't have a roller coaster of temperatures and so forth. It stays above freezing as long as possible, and in this area probably pretty much all winter if you use a good mulch. Okay, plants that are suitable for fall planting, and let's run through this rather quickly and then we can answer any questions you might have. Herbaceous perennials. This is a good time to plant the typical perennials. The things, you know, such as peonies, daylilies, hostas, and all the rest of those things. There's going to be probably a lot of that sort of planting to be done over the next year after this particular summer. I, as some of you know, grow plants for the farmer's market, and plants grown in containers above the ground, the soil is subject to that heat. In other words, you've got the ambient temperature surrounding that pot, so that the soil in that pot's going to get much hotter than if the soil would if it were planted in the ground. So at this point, I've got a tremendous number of plants that before the heat came looked good and were ready to sell, that basically I'm going in, cutting back and starting over. So there's going to be a lot, I think, of garden renovating to do as such, and just keep in mind that fall is an excellent time to do it. Spring flowering bulbs, as we said before, they tend to be only available at this point in the season. You can really plant them anytime before the soil freezes. Every once in a while where you have a call-in show, you'll have somebody, you know, along about the 1st of January. I found this bag of tulips in my garage. I haven't got it planted. Is it too late? Well, no, it isn't. Next July it will be, however, and sometimes they don't find them until then. One thing about buying spring flowering bulbs, and that is that particularly with the arrival of the discount store handling these things, they are displayed usually in the store at store temperatures as such. Very often, one other aspect of it is that discount store bulbs are a size or two smaller than those that you would get through garden center channels as such. So they do not have as much stored food to begin with, may not be quite as apt to flower as the bigger size bulb, etc. Okay, what happens then when you put these bulbs in a store and they're there for 2 or 3 months before somebody buys them? Metabolism, it's called. In essence, the bulb is a living thing, and with the heat in the store, you're burning up the stored energy, and therefore the bulb doesn't have as much energy left in it or stored food left in it to do its thing the next spring. And that probably was the biggest cause of failure of bulbs to flower, and you discover that the source has been a discount store. So you're going to buy them from discount store, and I don't say don't buy them. I just say buy them early when they're fresh, and then get them in the ground as quickly as you can. Annuals. Most annuals are planted in the spring because they live 1 year. There is a group, however, a classification that used to be referred to as winter annuals, that you could plant them in the fall. They would come through the winter. They might do some blooming during the winter, but then basically they're there established so that they come on quicker in the spring than they would if you waited to spring to plant them. Pansies really pretty much fit that category. And I'm very pleased to discover when I moved here that people do plant pansies in the fall, and they really do well for them. That was one of the things I used to preach on Long Island. And, you know, in spite of the fact that it's an advanced area as far as gardening is concerned, a lot of interest in it, they just didn't plant pansies in the fall. There are others, the cornflowers, bachelor buttons. You can just sow that seed in your garden. It'll come up and produce a little rosette in the fall, and time to sow them is September, by the way, about the time the fall rains come. Produce a little rosette in the next spring when, you know, people are just getting around to planting the seed of these things. These are up and ready to bloom. Annual larkspur fits that same category. Others that I would like to see tried in this area, and I don't know whether you've tried any of them or not, like the self-branching stalks and calendulas and some of these things. I think they ought to be tried because they fit that same category. All of them can stand being frozen. Also, hyacinth-flowered candy tuft, for example. You used to grow those commercially in greenhouses at 45 degrees for cut flowers in the winter. So my sense is that some of those things should be tried to give you a little more variety of winter annuals that could be planted here. Excuse me, trees and shrubs. I don't think there's any question but what fall is really the best season to plant these, and in many cases you can go on into the winter with them, but in most cases it would be advisable to plant them, get them in the ground by Thanksgiving or whatever, if you can do so. And I'll probably be the first one that will, disobey that rule. But the point is that the earlier you get them in the fall, once the conditions get right, the longer they have to get established before you run into winter situations. One other thing we should mention is that if you do have a dry winter, you should water particularly newly planted things, particularly evergreens, because they can become desiccated. And especially then if you have freezing weather where the root system freezes, and the root system with evergreens, and root system then cannot take up moisture to replace what's lost through the leaves. So that when you get a warm spell or things thaw out, you should water occasionally during the winter. Some winters you don't need to worry about that. Nature takes care of it. Lawns. The best time to seed, sod, or renovate a fescue lawn is the fall. In essence, we are in probably the most difficult region of the country, this transition zone between north and south for lawns. If you're farther south, you've got warm season grasses. If you're farther north, you use cool season grasses, bluegrass, etc. Here we're kind of in between. The fescue, unless you really pamper it to death, is going to turn brown in the summer no matter what you do. This year, I think, was one of those times. If you don't watch your business, the common Bermuda grass is going to take over because it thrives under this summer heat. Basically, cool season grasses, because of this same reason we mentioned earlier, it gives you 3 seasons before you hit summer. If you're going to grow the fescues, the cool season grasses, establish them in the fall. Establish them in the fall, renovate them in the fall, fertilize them in the fall, etc., and that will build up their strength, etc., to the point where they're more apt to be able to withstand the summer. Hot season grasses, on the other hand, warm season grasses don't do the renovating, the planting, and so forth until spring, because the temperature then is such that they are ready to take off. Vegetables. There are still some things, or will be some things, that you can plant on into September, certainly. The cold crops, in other words, cabbage and its relatives, many of those things do well under cool temperatures. Radishes. Even in Iowa, where I grew up, I used to always throw all my leftover radish seeds somewhere out in the garden in September, and you'd be out there pulling radishes until it froze. One other thing that I would love to see done here, I mentioned earlier this old superintendent at Old Westbury Gardens that had been there since it had been a private estate. He still lived there in a little cottage, and his cottage sat up on a little higher piece of property, land, than the nursery area, and there was a stone retaining wall that faced south. He had coal frames built up against that wall, and all winter he would harvest corn salad, he would harvest lettuce, he even had cabbage there for a long time. All of these salad crops he had all winter long. Warm days he'd pull the frames off of the top of them and let nature take care of them, and on a cold day he'd pull the frames over it. And of course the old timers, the old estate growers, made good use of either bamboo mats or canvas covers to keep these things from freezing. There was an old German-trained grower who was the superintendent of parks in Maplewood, New Jersey, who used to come into a horticulture meeting that met in the winter at the old Luchow's restaurant on 14th Street in New York. Okay, that was the restaurant where Diamond Jim Brady took Lillian Russell, and her bustle was in a museum case in the corner of the room where we met. He would bring dishpans full of greens that he was growing in New Jersey under a plastic tunnel. Not as like a Quonset, but a little one, maybe a couple of feet tall, etc. And our climate is not that much different. There's no reason, in other words, that we couldn't do the same thing here and do it effectively. Well, that fairly well covers what I wanted to make sure that I got covered, to emphasize the fact that fall is a good time to plant, and you all get out all your equipment and your enthusiasm all stirred up and plant like mad. Now, do we have any questions here? Yes, ma'am.
From the time you threw those seeds out, till you had some radishes you could eat, what was the lapse of time? Did it take like 8 weeks or so?
It depends, of course, on the variety or the cultivar of the radish, but in essence, you can buy something like Cherry Belle that will mature in 21 days. So if you have a rain or you water them in, within very little more than 3 weeks, you can actually be pulling radishes.
And would you say amongst the things that could be planted as a winter annual, calendula?
Calendula has not traditionally been planted here. I would like to see it planted. It's pot marigold. You can use it for greens as well, as the English do. But it grows under the same environmental conditions that cornflower does, cornflower works, annual larkspur does, annual larkspur works. So I would love to see the self-branching stalks and the calendulas tried to see if they might not work and give you a little more variety. You're not going to get a lot of bloom out of calendulas in the middle of winter. They get a big fleshy flower, and big fleshy flowers don't stand up under winter freezes. The plant, however, I think should. And so since the plant will be well established by spring, you're going to get flowers more quickly in the spring.
And does that help keep away pests that you don't want around?
Beg pardon?
Does that help keep you out of the pest area? Does it work like some marigolds that you plant?
Oh, I don't know that this will have any effect on the pests other than the plants will have head start when spring comes, because the pests are not going to be active during the winter. So that would be my only judgment on that one. Did you have a question?
Yes, I do. The same thing about 2 different perennials, salvia and pattycotin. I have a bed of several, and there's a rogue in each one that's grown way up here. Can I cut it back the same as you do the annual, and it branch out from the bottom, or is the top dead?
It probably, you should be able to. I would try it, certainly. You should be able to cut it back, and that usually will induce branching. So I would try it, certainly, at least. Without having seen it, it's a little, on some of those things, like if I were to come up to this guy, or call him on the phone, and say, you know, I got this kind of strange pain here. What should I do about it? And he, you know, in the old days, he'd have said, you know, the typical answer, take a couple aspirin and see me in the morning. Well, so in other words, sometimes it's a little difficult to diagnose plant problems and so forth without actually seeing them, but just based on general knowledge, I would think that you would be in good shape to cut them back and see what happens.
Yeah, we want to put in a large vegetable garden this fall. We're living up where there's sandy loam soil, there's peaches and blueberries and all kinds of things growing. What should we put into the soil to add to the nutritional level of soil, like manures and things like that?
Well, composted manure is an ideal source of organic matter, and you will have some nutrition there. If it's too well composted, you will have lost some of the nutrition, but what is there will tend to break down slowly, be released slowly, so you don't have sudden surges, in other words, but it feeds gradually. A lot of the benefit from that really comes again in increasing the water holding capacity of the soil, increasing the root environment of the soil, etc. So manure, compost, there's going to be a composting facility that will be online unless some problem happens out in Lincoln that is going to have compost for sale. And there are some of these chicken growers at this point, I think, that you can get some compost from at the present time. So that not all, let's put it this way, all good gardeners are organic gardeners. They may not all be organic gardening fanatics. They may use a little fertilizer along with it. They may use an occasional spray along with it, etc. but they will realize the value of organic matter on the soil. And the value of organic matter in the soil basically is that it makes a heavy soil more loose, friable, tillable. The roots can penetrate it better, loosens it up, gets more air in it. And with a sandy soil, the same material will make it so that it holds more moisture without being detrimental to the amount of air that's there for the roots. So organic matter is wonderful stuff, and that's what you're going to need. Yes?
Could you talk a little bit about mulch then? What do you recommend, or do you recommend specific types of mulch?
Wherever possible, I think it's advantageous to mulch almost anything. Mulches in general hold moisture, help keep down weeds, help keep the soil cool in summer, and help keep it warm in the winter, or more stable in the winter at least. As it relates to things such as herbaceous perennials, one of the problems that you tend to have with these perennial flowers is that with the alternating freezing and temperatures during the winter months, they sometimes heave out of the ground. A winter mulch can stabilize that situation. It's not meant necessarily keep warm, but it's meant there to stabilize it so you don't have these peaks and valleys. So it will help with that. So yes, mulches are wonderful. Almost any organic material can be used. You will find some decorative mulches of stone and so forth. My personal feeling is that they belong somewhere in Arizona, by and large. I really like the organic materials, not only because of the fact that eventually they're going to be incorporated in the soil and improve the soil itself, but they just look right in an area such as this to me. They've got the natural look. You know, if you're out there where you got sand and rock to begin with, why, the natural look is sand and rock. but I love organic. And I don't know that it makes too much difference what you use as such. The only thing is that if you're talking about a winter mulch, which is primarily put over the top of perennials, even, you know, not just around them, but over the top of what's left of the plant itself, there it wants to be light and fluffy. As light and fluffy as possible so that it doesn't compact in the winter, get pressed down by precipitation and so forth, and actually smother the plant. I have to laugh. The local paper in town gets a lot of their garden material from Associated Press. And I used to know a fellow who wrote for him for many years, an old fellow by name, last name was Aronson, and he was a good gardener. He knew what he's doing. I have no doubt that this young woman that's writing for him now is sharp, knows what she's doing, but she's writing for the Northeast. And when they printed a column that recommended salt hay as being the best, the best mulch for winter mulch, I said, there probably hasn't been salt hay here, and I don't know how many years has it been since the Ozark Plateau raised up out of the ocean. You can buy salt hay on the East Coast. So I guess my message there is that they really should probably rely more on local people who know local conditions. I don't know the answer to your question. I did everything else but probably.
What are good mulches on this area for garden, vegetables particularly?
I didn't hear the first part of it.
What should you use for mulch in this area for vegetable gardens?
Whatever you can get that's organic, that's the cheapest available. That, to me, that's almost the more, for the typical, particular vegetable gardens, that's almost the determining factor. What can you get that's going to do the job that's the cheapest, most readily available? You don't want to use fresh sawdust. Composted sawdust is wonderful. Fresh sawdust will steal the nutrients from the soil. One of the best things would be if you could find some farmer with spoiled hay. And Lord knows there's plenty of that around, if you can find it. And again, stable manure, horse stable. It's got a little manure in it, but it's primarily straw or wasted hay. Those are good things to use around vegetables. However, I had an old retired fellow that lives in the neighborhood, or did live in the neighborhood, is in town now, helping me with some things this spring, and I had some bales of straw I'd use for winter mulch over perennials, and he put it around my tomatoes, and I didn't really pay any attention to him. He got it about that deep. the interesting thing was I kept wondering what was eating those tomatoes, and I was going out there and looking every day, and I couldn't find what it was. And I went out once very early in the morning, and I found out what it was. That straw was providing such a good haven for slugs that every tomato plant had about a dozen slugs on it, and they were making their home under that hay.
What about grass clippings?
Grass clippings, the problem with grass clippings is that they are soft, succulent, subject to molding, etc., and if you put them on too heavy at a time, in essence, they tend to pack down kind of like linoleum, and they mold. Now, you can mix that in with other things. You can let it dry before you put it on, etc., and much of that will be overcome. Actually, newspapers are good mulch. And I wish there were a good way of shredding newspapers. If I could find some farmer that still had an old hammer mill out there, I would buy one, because that's a good way to use newspapers. And by the way, the black ink that's used today is a soybean-based ink. You don't have to worry about it.
What about the dry grass that you rake out of your zoysia in the spring?
Yeah, the only thing that would concern me about any of these dried grasses or lawn clippings and so forth, number one, if you have used a herbicide, don't use them until at least you get rid of that, because the herbicide might affect the vegetables or the flowers. Number two, just make certain that it doesn't contain weed seeds. If it's something where raking it out, in other words, you also got a lot of crabgrass seed, you might regret it. Other than that, if it's organic and it's available and it's cheap, why, I tend to use. When I had a business in Iowa many years ago, believe it or not, I grew a garden center, grew my own plants. I grew all my plants in pure sawdust. I learned how to use it. The guy had a pile 10 feet deep and covered several acres. He was only happy to get rid of it. And the customer would come to me and say, I have never had plants with root systems like those. You just had to learn how to fertilize it. And once you did that, why, it was wonderful. It was cheap. Yes.
I have tried to grow larkspur here, and it says perennial on the plant, and I have lost they bloom beautifully for a while, beautiful blue flowers, and then they just die.
The perennial larkspur really like a colder climate. If you want to see them at their best, you go to Niagara Falls, or I have a place in northwest Wisconsin. They do beautifully there. I have a picture. We were talking to somebody earlier. We visited some cousins that are my age in Germany that I really didn't know existed until recent years. And I'm standing in front of a flower bed in northern Germany with two cousins, one on either side, and with delphinium that far above my head. It's primarily climate. The annual, however, can be planted in the fall and will flower early in the spring, and it isn't going to last more than that 1 year. Now, I'm going to tell you one story, and then it's time to quit. As the director of Old Westbury Gardens, my chairman of the board, who was the daughter of the family, who grew up there when it was a private estate, lived next door. That's always very convenient for someone who wants to look down, the neck of somebody that's working. She would go through the garden every day. She never could understand why we didn't have those perennial delphinium all summer long. I tried to tell her. She didn't believe me. Delphinium normally in that climate would flower in June, and the climate we're in the same zone, but the ocean and so forth moderates it on Long Island to the fact where you cut them back and you get another flowering in August. As with many of those rich families, they had many estates, and they only stayed at this estate when she was a youngster for 2 months in spring, May and June, 2 months in the fall, September and October. Delphinium didn't happen to be blooming at that time. So anyway, at this time I was writing a column for the New York Times, and you know what they say. If you read it in the Times, it's got to be true. So I sat down after one of my arguments with her and explained the whole delphinium thing. Monday morning, she had the article clipped out and came into my office ready to talk. I finally gotten through to her, and she realized that it really wasn't possible. So that is how I used my avocation, which was writing a column for the Times, to help me in my vocation, which was trying to deal with a chairman of the board. Anything else before we wind up? Oh, we were going to tell you about this. Yeah, we'll do this very quickly. This is a condition, a situation, or a type of growth called fasciation. Not fascination, but fasciation. It can, in some plants, be the result of the genetic inclination of the plant, and the best example of that's the old-fashioned coxcomb, the flower on it. Okay. Otherwise, it is induced by something, and that something could be radiation, gamma rays, that we have no control over. It could be air pollution, which we could have some control over, but tend not to. Or it's, any one of a number of things such as that. And basically what happens, and this is one of those so-called miniature hollyhocks, the malva, that many of you have planted, and you know how it normally would grow. In essence, some of those things, or one of those things, will come along and kill the tip, meristem, the cell or the tip that's responsible for dividing and producing that stem, and then all the rest of the cells below that seem to say, hey, he's gone, we're going to take over. So that instead of getting a straight stem as you normally would have, each one of those produces a string of tissues below it that's trying to do what the tip did. So it probably is the result of some air pollution, I suspect. And this one spot in the bed of these that I was growing to sell at the farmer's market, and there were probably 6 plants like this, and on either side, none. I don't know if you saw today or in the news last night on the weather forecast that are predicting an ozone alert in Tulsa today. How many years before they predict one for Fayetteville? Maybe our terrain will be such that it will create the kinds of updrafts and so forth that disperse this. The reason I didn't stay at UCLA and get a PhD is that after inhaling that about a year and a half and coughing up blood, I decided it was to move on, the time to move on. So anyway, it's the result of something that in essence kills the meristematic cell that does all the dividing at the tip, and then all the others try to take over.
Do you have, before you quit, Carl, do you have any tips on fall dividing of the hostas and the daylilies that we should follow?
Yeah, I did note in there, I think that it's a good time to divide, and it is. Again, for the same reason, that you divide in the fall, they're going to be better established, and you're going to get more out of them the next season as such. I like to divide things like hostas, particularly in the fall. If you divide them, wait until in the growing season, for example. Let's say you cut one in 2. You got 2 parts. In essence, they're not going to be symmetrical because you've disrupted that year's growth. If you do it now, they will be symmetrical, etc.
Well, can you just go down like the daylily? You've got easy things to pick out.
You can divide them down to as small a unit as you've got top and root with almost any perennial. You may not want to do that. You may want to have a division that's big enough that it's going to be effective right away that first year. If it's a peony, for example, you probably want something that has at least 5 of those eyes, those buds on it, because that one will probably do some flowering the first year. If it's a German iris, the rhizomatous iris, you're probably going to want to divide. Always, by the way, take the newest part of the plant, the part that's out at the perimeter, not in the center, which is the oldest part, but what you save, take from the perimeter, because that will be the freshest, the healthiest, least apt to be rotten, least apt to be infected with borers, etc. With something like an iris, where you probably want a symmetrical clump, you take several divisions and put them together. You know that the iris, the rhizome forks, like, you know, you're holding your fingers this way. Okay, you plant like 3 of them in a clump, each facing a different direction, and then you've got a symmetrical clump. So you've got 2 here and 1 back here, you see. And that gives you a symmetrical clump right away. Otherwise, you plant them just one division with 2 rhizomes heading in the same direction, they're going to head in that direction as such. But the size of the division probably will depend for somebody in your own garden where you're not propagating them for sale, etc. It probably is going to be something that will be big enough that it will give you a showing the next year. And you know, it's easier to demonstrate than it is to describe, except on something such as a peony, where you can actually count the buds. But it's a good time to do it.